Welcome back to Beyond the Wrench. My name is Jay Goninen, and I am your host. On today's show, we welcome Anders Gustafson, and I think this is going to be a really interesting episode because this came together last minute. We had some guests reschedule, and we had put a call out on LinkedIn, or I had put a call out on LinkedIn for podcast guests, and Anders answered the call. And we had conversations in the past about having him on and then kind of dropped that conversation over time for whatever reason. But Anders, we're finally getting you on the show, and it's such a pleasure to finally be able to sit down and talk with you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jay. Super excited to be here. As a regular listener, this is really exciting for me.
Well, so tell us a little bit about yourself. I can tell in all of our conversations, you're deeply passionate about the industry and wanting to see it go to a better direction in a lot of ways, similar to the same thing I'm looking for. And I'm really curious to dive into your background because I do think it's unique and different. And I want to learn more about you. So how did you get into this industry?
Sure. Yeah. No, I do think it's different than a lot of people. It's not the usual path. So I, had a normal college experience and had my first job out of school working in finance, and that job parlayed into a role with one of the large automotive repair chains. I got hired by the corporate office to be kind of a financial and data analyst and crunch numbers for them, help them with presentations, business performance, these sorts of things. And I was in that role for about 5 or 6 years, getting kind of itchy, wasn't really loving my life there. But the one thing that it had exposed me to was analyzing the performance of shops, for over and over and over again. And I, just kind of had these, mini realizations. I said, man, these are, this is a thing, owning a shop, running a shop, when executed properly, seems like a really interesting business opportunity. I had no experience working on cars. I had, almost no, real business experience, to be honest. I was just kind of good with numbers and was able to see that. So sort of foolishly or not, I took that as my motivation to kind of get out of that job and try something new. And my wife and I moved to a place that was closer to our family and found a great piece of real estate and built a shop. um, as
Wow.
kind of as kind of a way to get into, I had an entrepreneurial itch. I wanted to figure out, what my opportunity was to build something, and I, saw it through shop ownership. So for better, for worse, that's how I ended up in it. And it has definitely informed, my experience and the way I view a lot of topics in the industry, especially as how it relates to compensation.
And that's a lot of what our conversation is going to be today is around technician compensation. And I love maybe your viewpoints on it. The one thing I do want to talk about before we dive into that is your approach when you went to start the shop, right? It was going from having no experience to leading the way. And when I say no experience, I think you discredit yourself a little bit because those exercises and what you've done in your prior career to that, you learn a lot through numbers. And in a lot of ways, you might have started off with the right side of knowledge in knowing the number side and knowing the business side. Whereas in a lot of cases, especially on the independent shop side, they're starting off with a technical knowledge, but not necessarily the business knowledge. So you might have had an advantage in terms of being able to see the industry or see the way a shop runs in a different light than most do. How was your approach and your mindset going into that? Because that is really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, looking back on it, that it all seems to make sense. But I tell you what, I was terrified, going into it, because as much as I could have it all make sense in a spreadsheet or on a piece of paper, there's a lot more that goes into it, obviously. Um, I do think, having that knowledge and kind of knowing what I was working toward, even just having like a year one revenue goal and, an understanding of, when we might be able to make a profit and what I theoretically should be able to pay people, was really helpful. It gave you a plan, a course of action. But it didn't hire people. It didn't bring customers in the door. It didn't, teach you how to fix cars. There were still a lot of things that you had to execute on.
So how did you navigate that initial part? Because if you're piecing together a staff going into that, I'm assuming, were you hiring people right off the bat, or were you working it by yourself initially? What led you to kind of get that train going?
So yeah, my thought process was I don't know anything when it comes to fixing cars. So I need to uh, augment me, right? I can help with some aspects of the business. I felt relatively confident that the customer part of it, I could handle, that I would, do okay interfacing with customers and building trust and these sorts of things. But, I was going to need the right people in the right seats on the bus to actually, deliver on what we were promising. My kind of early, somewhat naive mindset was, we all kind of know the negative stereotypes of the industry, right? That slimy mechanics are out there to steal from consumers and these sorts of things. And right or wrong, whether that is true or not, obviously it's not true for the vast majority of our industry. But I had a little bit more of a consumer mindset than maybe the average new shop owner who grew up, in shops and had the shop mindset. So my thought process was, I was like, I'm going to get out there and just try to do everything I possibly can to kind of tackle that stereotype. Um, and it led to some good things and some bad things, right? I mean, I certainly feel like we were able to build a loyal customer base and build trust and have great relationships. But we also struggled in a lot of ways because we would get, let's say, taking advantage isn't necessarily the right word, but we let the customer at sometimes, really dictate our business, both to the detriment of my kind of sanity and mental health, to the, detriment of the work-life balance of technicians. And in a lot of areas, we kind of had this thought that, we should be able to serve as many customers as possible, and the customer is right. And, and we need to figure out how to make our, business work within that mindset. And it did lead to, good sales numbers. It was, something that kind of helped us establish a reputation. But it also, led me to my greatest transition as a business owner, which was, I decided my role as a shop owner was no longer to be, customer centric, but that I needed to be employee centric. That I had this responsibility to be the employer of choice if that is what or that is what I needed to do in order to grow the business. If I was only focusing on the customer, on the consumer, we could, have shiny, nice sales numbers, but we weren't going to have the quality of life and the benefits of business ownership that I was looking to achieve.
I think that gives you unique perspective in how you look at a technician and the respect level that you have for technicians. I talk a lot about it, about my experience in particular, where I was not a great technician coming out of tech school, and it gave me maybe a different outlook or a different perspective than that technician that's really, really good and thinks everybody should be really, really good. And I think when you're dependent on those folks, especially as you were going into that situation where you need these people, right? You need these technicians to perform for you, because if they don't, it's not like you can just go out and pick up wrenches and start working, right? You are really relying on these people. And I think there are a lot of people in our industry that could learn from that, right? Even though you can pick up the wrenches doesn't mean you should pick up the wrenches. It doesn't mean that you should immediately go back out to the shop. And I think that's the default with a lot of independent shop owners. And that's where they really paralyze themselves a little bit from being able to expand the business without being totally reliant on them. So as you enter that, and, you know, I think looking back, we all have hardships in growing businesses, and it's not easy. That's why, you know, not everybody can do it, right? It's a challenging thing, but it might have been a little bit of a blessing in disguise with you coming in that way, because I think it has to drive some level of appreciation for technicians that maybe others don't have.
100%. So looking back on it, I can sort of recall at least three different, they weren't, sudden realizations or things that I kind of absorbed over time, but I think it speaks to what you're discussing. So, um, the first, this is going to sound crazy. It's going to make me sound uh, probably naive at best and maybe kind of dumb at worst. But when we got into that shop and that first summer, and and business is doing pretty well, and we're sweaty, and there's grease, and there's a lot of things going on. I just remember sitting there and thinking, like, I was making more as my in a data analyst role than what most, not all of my technicians at that point, but what much more than half of my technicians at that point were making. And I was like, man, I sat in the air conditioning. I was on my computer. It didn't really matter when I came, when I went. There was, and I just remember thinking, like, this all seems so backwards. Like, how is it that role, was valued so much more, at least in dollars and salary, than the really physical hard work that's going on in the shops. That was one thing that just always stood out to me. I mean, I had other things too. So I had no real management experience. I was in my late 20s. I think technically in my data analyst role, I had one guy who kind of worked for me, but not really. And so I definitely had some insecurities or uncertainties around why anyone would come work for me. I felt like I had a lot to prove, and I had a lot of thinking to do around why anyone takes any job. I was able to really sit back and think about it, because it wasn't, I didn't have that management experience to know that I could create a culture that people would want to be part of. I just was trying to figure it out. And then the last thing, which kind of leads into the compensation. Again, this will sound to people who have been in the industry for a long time, but I was 28 and I had never heard of flat rate. I had no idea what flat rate was. I had always kind of been in a salaried position, and this was my first exposure to these performance pay. Let's call them, the large bucket of compensation models out there. Performance pay models that exist. Having a flat rate shop, this is not a debate necessarily about flat rate, but it never
Sure.
occurred to me, right? It just, because I didn't even know it existed. So, when I started setting up my compensation plans, they were, they weren't necessarily salaried, but they were more base heavy than was probably normal for the industry. And that was just because I didn't know what else was out there.
It's interesting to hear you talk through all of this. And again, I can't help but feel like there might be an advantage in starting off in that really green type of territory, even from the leadership standpoint, because what you said there really kind of triggered me in going back through my history. In when we first started the company, when we first started WrenchWay, it started off as Find a Wrench and then went to WrenchWay. I remember the first few people I hired, they were really, really good. Some of them are still here. And when they would accept my offer, I'm like, are you sure? Like, are you sure you
Yeah,
like, are you sure
yeah.
you want to give up your really good, stable job to come work for us? And to their credit, they were like, yeah, I understand. And I almost went the opposite direction in trying to talk them out of it. And it's very odd when you said that, I was like, oh my goodness, that clicked with me because I went through the exact same thing.
So I always tried to keep that at the forefront of my perspective, and that was, this isn't exactly true, but employees are exchanging their freedom to be part of your organization, right? I mean, they have agency. They can do what they feel like they can and should be doing, right? And so you should not take it for as an employer, you should not take that for granted. There is absolutely no reason to discount what that person is giving up to be part of your organization. That doesn't mean the feeling is always mutual and that every employer-employee relationship works out, or that everything has to be hunky-dory all of the time. But as kind of a bit of a principle, that is what I was trying to work toward. In the end, I viewed their everyone's motivation to kind of have a productive day's work and get home and do everything else that I would rather be doing than working. And I kind of tried to keep that perspective out front. And yeah, I think maybe not having I certainly didn't have any scars, right? So I didn't have any scars from, bad employment experiences. So being green in that regard was helpful. Um, and then, yeah, just kind of being able to shape something that felt aligned with what I thought mattered to me was definitely a benefit of not knowing anything else.
This week's episode of Beyond the Wrench is brought to us by Jasper Engines and Transmissions. Okay, your customer's engine or transmission has failed, but now is not the time for them to trade their vehicle. Not without a working engine or transmission. Besides, would they have kept their vehicle another 3 to 5 years if their engine or transmission had not let them down? If you answered yes, then Jasper Engines and Transmissions is your choice to give your customer's vehicle new life and many thousands of miles of enjoyable driving performance. When considering the high cost of a new or newer used vehicle, there's a pretty good case to be made for replacing a drivetrain component that has failed or is delivering poor performance. Rather than trading their car, truck, van, or SUV, install a quality remanufactured Jasper product for less than your customer would have to invest in a new vehicle or a newer used vehicle. Check out their website at jasperengines.com to learn more about the money saving value of Jasper. What did your family think when you left your nice cushy job to go start a shop?
Um, it was it was interesting. I mean, very supportive,
Yeah.
of course, but from the day we opened our doors, which was in 2015, my mom was asking, "Well, what are electric vehicles going to do to your business?" And she never stopped asking that, and it was a fair question.
Yeah.
It's something that you need to think about, but that is just kind of a reflection into her mindset, which is, I'm trying to think about the downside here. What could go wrong?
Pretty smart
So
lady to be asking that question, right? Like, just
yeah,
that's very smart.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And then my I think it was just I mean, I was fortunate to have that support. I think my family was just kind of like, yeah, that sounds like like something you should do. um you know it seems to make sense. And so having that kind of network was really helpful. I also had business partners, to be honest, that were helpful. People who when I showed them, again, being comfortable with the numbers, when I was able to show them what I thought we could do, I was able to attract a little bit of outside investment, people to help me, get everything off the ground. And they too were very supportive in the launch.
That's another piece you don't hear a lot about most shops, right? They're not bringing in outside funding unless it's maybe through a bank. A lot of times it's through friends and family and trying to just kind of piece it together. And I think a lot of times there's shops that make it through that, but man, is that a challenge. Shops are not cheap to run. And especially in those early days, getting it off the ground, understanding that, it's not just the rent that you're paying for insurance, workers' comp, your work, the lights to keep the lights on. Everything is expensive. And so when you go into that, again, I think your background as an analyst probably really helped you there to understand some of the barriers that you were going to see going into it, and knowing that, hey, you know what? I'm probably smart to try and bring in some outside funding to make this happen. I think in a lot of ways, most people can't make that happen because they're maybe not in their head. They don't think they can put together a business plan, or they don't think that they can piece together numbers to be able to put together a forecast, or maybe they put together a forecast that's too unrealistic and somebody looks at it, maybe a potential outside investor, and says, that's not real. What advice would you have for somebody looking to do something like that?
I think there's a lot of a lot of techs become shop owners, and I don't know. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but there's techs may be confident in their repair skills, but perhaps more humble about what that represents, or what that means. And so that's kind of been, it was one of my favorite things about starting a shop, right? Was that in this world where so many people kind of sell not physical objects, and I don't mean this in a bad way.
Sure.
I was really excited to have a business where I was like, man, I can point to like what we
What we're
did
doing.
fix, yeah, what we're doing. We could see that. And techs may downplay that. It comes more naturally to them, and they undervalue themselves, their skills, them themselves as a product. uh, One thing that I always kind of interests me is that automotive, it's not 100% unique, but it's one of the few industries where that person, that technician, is more or less the product. When you
Mm-hmm.
talk about the combination of their skills, knowledge, and then you throw in things like their own tools, right? What we as automotive repair shop owners are offering is a streamlined way, and a convenient way to access that. And every every business is built around a product, and every business has value, and your product is linked to your value. So it was just always kind of clear to me that technicians, skill, knowledge, what they present is inherently valuable. And there is there can be you can make a financial case around it. It's been one of my kind of favorite things to talk about more recently, is why automotive is not just a a necessary industry, but why it's an attractive industry, for everyone who can commit themselves to it.
As you're talking through this, I think this segues really nicely into our discussion around compensation and technician compensation. I think one of the big struggles in the industry, and maybe it's more through my eyes and how I see a shop, is that because I do see the value so much, and I think there are a lot of shops that really see that value, and they want to pay their people well, and they want to treat their people really well. But when they look at their bank statement, or they're looking at QuickBooks, hopefully they're looking at QuickBooks. Hopefully they're looking at their bank statement. Hopefully they're looking at the financials and the KPIs, because I think that's something where a lot of people go wrong. But I think the desire and the heart to pay their people and treat their people really well is there, but then they run into frustration when they look at it from a profitability standpoint and say, "Oh, what the going rate for a tech is right now and what I'm able to pay, they're not aligning, and I'm really struggling because I can't find people because I can't pay competitively." I think this is a big issue we've got, right?
Yeah, 100%. So in my kind of more recent work, I originally was, really focused on the compensation part of it. I saw the way that you were addressing the technician shortage, and I thought there was you know, a, a complementary strategy to bring compensation and different types of compensation to the forefront for this discussion. And in meeting with shop owners, and just talking to expanding my network there, I started to learn more about what you're discussing. So I did not have an appreciation for the fact that I had this kind of numbers knowledge, business knowledge was kind of, I
Ah,
was more comfortable with it than the average shop owner. And so when I would try to engage them about their compensation philosophy and these sorts of things, it was like we would reach a stopping point, because all of a sudden, questions about their financials, or their value, or the business, or all these sorts of just numbers in general, always ended up, creating roadblocks. Like, it was like it's like, oh man, we need to take a couple steps back, and get some basic building blocks in place, before we can, dive into something as sensitive and vital as compensation. So I've ended up, spending a lot of time now, trying to figure out how to make that accessible, to shop owners, to technicians, to aspiring shop owners. Is, okay, how do we understand the business, of automotive repair, and once we get that nailed down, we can start to think about what that means to be an employer, from compensation and incentives and all these sorts of things, from a, not just from a philosophy standpoint, but from an actual, like, okay, what can I afford to pay and how do I pay it, sort of
isn't it
stuff.
funny how things kind of tied together in your background? You have that numbers background, then you pair it up with owning a shop and running a shop and being able to put it together in a way where I think you do a really nice job at not making somebody feel stupid, right? Of not making somebody that doesn't understand numbers as much feel like they're being talked down to. And I think that's such an important piece here as you try to educate people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of fun. I can definitely put myself in their shoes. I mean, I remember learning, I remember my A tech kind of like dragging me over and making me do brakes for the first time. Like they were gonna bite me. Um, I was, but I pop open accounting software or a spreadsheet or whatever, and I feel like a superhero. So it's just a recognition that everybody, almost everybody's really good at something, and it is, there's no point in highlighting what they may not be good at, because they could easily point back at me, for some of my deficiencies. So yeah, that's been my approach. I like numbers. It makes me feel warm and cozy to have nice balanced books and things, kind of every, in their place. And I have actually found that analogy to work well with, really excellent techs. I find that some of the best techs are the ones that, have that everything has its place mindset, organization mindset. And, the financial aspects of a business uh, can jive as long as you know where to look.
I love that perspective. And I want to really take this time to shift into diving into technician compensation. And this is always such a extreme argument one way or the other, if it goes flat rate versus non-flat rate. And you'll hear both technicians and leadership or management talk through this. And at times I think they're almost saying the same thing, but then because they're saying it differently, they're not agreeing on what that means. Flat rate can just be a lightning rod type of topic in general, as can any other compensation system. And it's because it's really, really important, right? How we pay these technicians, how those technicians feel like they're treated. I know there are a lot of technicians that in the flat rate culture, the flat rate system, a lot of times get really nervous because they don't have that security blanket of, am I going to be able to take care of my family this month if no work comes in the shop? Right. And I think it's a really relevant, if you take your pride out of it as a shop and you say, I'm going to take a step back and just kind of put myself in their shoes, you can see where the concern is and why if you're in that situation and say you've got a young family and you're not guaranteeing yourself that you're going to take anything home to literally feed your family, that is very, very concerning. And then on the opposite side of it, you look at the shop side and you say, okay, we need to remain profitable enough to be able to take care of all of you and provide you with jobs. And if we don't have work coming in the door, we can't afford to pay you because we're not profitable then. And so at the end of the day, I think a lot of it comes down to if you have enough work coming in the door and if you're profitable enough to take care of everybody. But talk to me a little bit about where we even start in this conversation, because this is such a loaded topic and one where we could go a million different directions with it.
Right. Yeah. So the overarching theme that I always try to take into consideration is that there is no best pay plan, right? I mean, because pay is personal, compensation is personal. What people value does differ. That doesn't. I'm not advocating that every shop, can have a gajillion different pay plans. It's just a recognition and an admission that all of them have some validity, something that they do well that can provide a win-win for both employer and employee. But more broadly, the my thoughts around compensation. Well, it goes back to what we talked a little bit about, how technicians are the product, right? That they are what we as businesses are really marketing and offering. And I just think that there's been too much unhealthy emphasis or ways that people can kind of abuse that. It goes to the point that you were bringing up, that, well, if nothing comes in the door, then, I can't afford to pay you. And that's just the wrong mindset to have. The way I sometimes summarize it is employers viewing compensation as a stick when really it should be a carrot. I mean, effective compensation is all about building effective incentives. And people who really advocate for flat rates say, well, that is the ultimate incentive, but it downplays the role of the shop owner or the business owner in that relationship. Yes, technicians are responsible for fixing the cars, but it's kind of an unspoken agreement that you as the shop owner figure out how to get the cars in the door. And you the shops that kind of figure out that relationship, shops that are spending the money on their reputation, spending their money on the marketing, spending their money on training, spending their money on all the things that kind of make them more visible and increase their trust. They don't seem to run into these issues, even those that pay with flat rate. So it, it's hard to say that one way is the right way, but it is just important to remember that you need to build incentives. You need to have an approach to compensation that is all about valuing that person and the exchange that they are giving you for the time that they are being there.
So I want to talk about how your brain works here, because being that you came from outside the industry into it, I really enjoy the fact that you don't have the programming that a lot of us had growing up in this industry, to where we were taught a certain way and that's the way we go. And as you look at it, when you're looking at putting together an incentive program and you're looking at it through a numbers based standpoint as well as a people side, right? You've stated how much you value technicians, but where do you start when you're looking at putting together a incentive plan for technicians? How do you tell what you can afford? How can you tell if the carrot that you're putting out there is big enough for somebody to actually care about? Walk me through your thought process here as you're looking at putting together some form of incentive plan.
Sure. So I mean, the important thing to remember is that a shop is a business like any business, and a business is a financial model, right? There are just kind of inputs, outputs, and there is so much that you can afford to spend on everything and still generate a profit. So I was fortunate for kind of all for having some sense for what I could afford to pay, knowing what my cost of parts would be, knowing what all of the other expenses would be, and knowing what my desired bottom line would be. All of these things fit together, and you kind of have a predefined range for how much you can afford to pay your employees. And I downplayed it at the time, but it is so crucial. I mean, it is just something you have to spend the time to learn and understand. So not all shops are the same. They don't all have the same, service writer and technician setup, and there's different types of shops. So it's that percentage range, or that is not identical for everyone, but I will use the broad strokes that I had in my business. I kind of backed into the fact that I felt like I could afford to pay, my top producing technicians r- roughly one third of what they were able to generate in parts and labor. That wasn't a hard and fast rule, but that was kind of the the number that I kind of settled on, that made sense for me. May not be the same for everyone, but I kind of knew what it was in my instance. And so the best thing I was able to do was just say that, to my technicians, so in interviews or in performance reviews and these sorts of things, um, that was kind of the basis for the discussion. What would you like to earn? Where do you need to be? What makes sense for you? How do you value yourself? And I would always tell them, I said, there's no number that scares me. Tell me that you need to make $10,000 weekly, and I'll tell you, okay, well, we got to sell $30,000 in parts and labor weekly off of just your bay or two. So we kind of had to reset expectations. But I was always very transparent about that, and that set the basis for our compensation philosophy, that the guys knew that there was a clear link between their earning capacity and what the business generated. Um, of course, that sounds a little bit like flat rate, but the main difference there is that inevitably I offered the downside protection. So I was always on a base plus performance model, which is, some sort of hourly rate for the time that you actually spent in the shop, plus a performance bonus, usually related to hours turned. Sometimes we had some different other, incentives. That was where getting to know the person and what mattered and what I needed, out of that individual person kind of came into play. Again, there is no perfect pay plan. There is absolutely no way to say that you should, pay $5 per this, an extra dollar per this, and all these sorts of things. It's if anything, the more complicated that you make it, I would argue, the worse it becomes. It is more about knowing that relationship between the employees' desired pay, what they need to pay, what they need, to receive to exchange their freedom to be part of your team, and what the business needed to produce, and then backing into how to make that work between an hourly and performance combination. It is very different for every business. There is no right answer, but in the end, it is just a math question. It is just a process of putting it down and making the calculations. And so that was the part that I was always very comfortable with, and was happy to share with my technicians, to kind of put down on paper what my thought process was, so that we could be on the same page.
A few things right there that just, I think, for anybody listening, and this doesn't matter if you're in a dealership or an independent or what kind of shop you're running, one of the things that really stuck out to me is that you had a conversation with your technicians or potential technicians upfront about financials. And so many shops try to hide behind some type of curtain where they're not transparent with financials and why a business needs to run the way it is. And it really impacts communication in such a negative way if that technician doesn't believe what you're saying, or they don't understand why the labor rate is $150 an hour and they're only being paid 20, because there's a big gap in between there. And if we don't take the time to break that down and show them how complicated and how expensive it is to run a shop, we just drive that anxiety. We drive that really distrust between a technician and a leader. And a lot of times we'll pin that on the technician, but it's not necessarily the technician's fault. When we leave their headspace open to interpretation, it's not their fault. It's human nature to wonder, right? Like, what are these guys doing? And if you happen to pull in with a new vehicle or a boat or something at some point, and you're not explaining that, it gets ugly.
It gets really ugly.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics says technicians make around $46,000 a year. Does that sound like BS to you? We thought so too. At WrenchWay, we work with some of the best shops and dealerships across the country, and we've seen technicians make a lot more than that. So we decided to gather our own data. We're excited to announce the launch of our new online technician pay tool. You can now search technician pay by industry, shop type, location, and experience. We've already had over 3,000 technicians submit their pay data anonymously. You can explore the pay data and even submit your own data anonymously at wrenchway.com/pay. Thank you for your continuous support of WrenchWay as we strive to promote and improve automotive and diesel careers. We couldn't do it without you.
My favorite training exercise that we would do, we would do it sporadically, kind of when there would had a new team member or so. But I had this piece of cardboard, and my wife and I one night took sticky tack and put $100 bills, across it. And we brought it in, put it in front of all the guys, and I said, okay, there's this is $100. I am going to take a poll to see out of every $100, how many do you think we, I keep. I have, you can't see it. I'm putting quotes. I keep, right? That because I was trying to, uh, kind of play along with them in that sense, because clearly, that wasn't keeping anything. A lot of the money was going back into the business. But man, it was really eye opening for me the first time we did it. So, we had, some guys guessing 50, 60, 70 dollars out of every 100 were quote unquote profit. Some guys, figured out that there was a trick and they said 0 or 1. I was like, no, because then why would I do this? Too. That was like just as important to have that revelation that no, it's not an overwhelming majority, but also no, it's not nothing, right? There has to be some return for the risk that goes into business ownership. So we weren't a fully open book company. We didn't, share every last number
Nor should
with
you. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But we tried to have a transparent culture um, around as many things as we possibly could, and tried to build some of that financial literacy and business mentality among our employees. And you, I like to think it helped. I don't know for sure that it's a really difficult thing to measure, but in the end, it was just one of those that felt right to me.
I think, again, I can't stress this enough, but having your financial background and feeling comfortable having those conversations with technicians to be able to explain to them, and honestly, not even just technicians, like there's so many service managers and service advisors that need to have this conversation. They need knowledge on this. And I think in a lot of ways, when you go into that yearly review and you're talking about a raise, and it can be a very, very uncomfortable part of the conversation, especially if they don't know what you're basing it off of. And again, I'm going to pick on your approach to this, because I think it's really, really good in that if you're explaining it and you're laying it out, and then maybe then you take that, the initial thought process, and then you're adding that career development plan to that. Hey, if you do produce, if you do produce this amount, you can bump yourself up. I think at its just core, it's such a good practice just to create that understanding and why you need to turn a profit, and why, in order for you to get a raise, we've got to produce more money to be able to pay you more or offer that additional benefit that we'd love to offer you. I can't, I don't
Yeah,
even know what
no,
I'm
no,
saying here. It's just so
no, no, no.
important.
So I think the strongest example that I ran into is, for the first few years we didn't offer health insurance. It's just, everyone knows it's really expensive, right?
Yeah.
And even though the business was doing well, still very much a small business, but it was clearly something that mattered to an overwhelming majority um, of the employees. And that was one where, no matter how many times I sat and I ran the numbers, it was there was still some leap of faith that had to be taken, but I could see it, right? I knew what that would cost, and I knew what had to give, right? So either that was coming out of the bottom line permanently, right? Or we had to grow revenue or cut expenses to cover that completely brand new expense. There aren't you don't often run into going a couple of years in business and then just boom, several $1,000s a month in additional expense. So I the approach that I was happy that we took was, I didn't go to the guys and say, look, we have to be able to do this before we start offering insurance. I said, I'm willing to offer insurance right now on a 1 year trial. And we need to review this after 12 months to see what we can do as a team, as an organization, to make up for this new additional expense. I might be willing to, I was willing to give up some profit temporarily with the idea that this was an investment toward the future. We knew what that what that revenue target had to be to get us back to the margins that we were comfortable operating in. And we didn't have to do anything differently to get there. We were already on a growth trajectory. It was already kind of known that our goal is to grow the business at a healthy clip every year. So that means continuing to get better in our procedures and our customer service and everything that we need to do that we know helps us grow each year. I was like, we really can't take our eye off the ball now, because we're not just trying to grow for growth's sake. We're trying to grow to support this benefit, this expense that matters. But without a doubt, you always kind of sleep easier, always have a kind of clearer picture if you know the goal. And we always had that goal that we could work toward, and we always shared it openly.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the power of visualizations or visuals in general in trying to get your point across? You talked about the hanging the $100, $101 bills up on a board. And I always love visuals because it does help maybe connect the dots of what somebody's thinking and helps them maybe understand it in a way that is really easy to remember. What drove you down that route to create that visual or think of that?
I mean, as shop owners, hopefully most shops are doing some sort of visual, some sort of inspection, ideally with some photographs. And that's how we sell value to our customers. And again, my role being taking care of the employees, not taking care of the customers as much. That is what I challenge myself to do. So visual learning, visualization, visual tools, visual aids were super important. I was inspired by the Great Game of Business book.
Yes.
Yeah. And
It's been a
trying
while since
to
I've read that. Yeah.
yeah,
I need to reread
and
that. Yeah.
I wasn't like full in, running games all the time and this sort of stuff. It was a little bit of a pipe dream. But I took some of the inspiration from it, and certainly the transparency and making clear what we're working toward is something that I borrowed heavily on. So, I mean, we we did things like the dollar bills. I mean, all of our operational reports were always available to everyone. And, that had a decent level of detail. It didn't show kind of all of the operating expenses of business, but it certainly, we weren't hiding our revenue, our cost of goods, these sorts of things from anyone. And, I encouraged, depending on the role, some people, had a responsibility to do something with those numbers, write something down, put it someplace on a board, something like that. Others were just kind of encouraged to participate in it. But making it part of the responsibility of the technician or the manager or the service advisor really, really helped them start to grasp it and feel a little stake in what was going on.
It's great stuff. So let's take this last. We got about 8 minutes left, and I want to talk more about compensation. And I want to look at where we go from here, right? I think a lot of times in our heads, we break it down to basically a few different buckets. You've got just straight hourly or salary. You've got hourly plus incentive. You've got flat rate. And I totally agree with you on the point that the more complicated you make it, the less people understand it and the less effective it is. But as we continue to look for ways to incentivize these really, really talented technicians, what opportunities are there to get creative, to do something different, to maybe reward your technicians in a fashion that others aren't, and looking at it through a standpoint where you can use pay as a competitive advantage over a lot of people? Uh, where are there things that we can grow on?
Yeah. So I listened one of your more recent episodes with Tanner Brandt. One of the things he talked about was, okay, we need to focus on W-2 pay. So that's one very easy thing that everyone should make the change to analyzing. Right. I really need to know what that employee earned. I don't care about how they earned it or what, the mechanisms and everything behind it. Like, in the end, that is the number that matters most. And we should start by having an open and honest review of, okay, is that, if I were that person, what would I think
Would I
about
take
this
that?
job?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
would I take that? Don't think about, oh, what it could be. Oh, I've set up this pay plan so that my guy could make X, Y, or Z. That is where a lot of good intentions fall short, because the goals are too high, or the mechanisms are too complicated. So it does behoove you to simplify it, and then also understand, okay, what is the end result of all of this. From there, you know and that's obviously not revolutionary. That's not reinventing the wheel, but I do think it is a really important exercise. From there, um, there are a lot of different ways that you can go. So, the thing that really interests me, and I'm kind of exploring and haven't figured out what it means, though, is this idea that well-run automotive repair businesses have significant value, and in other businesses that have value, there is an opportunity for employees to participate in the value of the business. And so, what does that mean? That usually means through stock ownership, profit sharing, something like that. Because the value of a business is directly related to its profit. I'm not suggesting that we're at a point where we need to start offering stock in all of our shops. That's not really, it's been proven that just having that type of incentive is actually not super effective, but it does speak to what we're trying to do. It speaks to, if the reason that we're here is to have a successful business has value, employees are crucial in creating that value, and what are the ways that we can reward them um, for creating that value. The most obvious one has got to be profit sharing. That is the one that is kind of pretty easy to understand, pretty easy to implement. It's not that much different than a commission structure or something like that, or even a base plus performance structure. It's just moving around. As opposed to focusing maybe on hours turned to on some measure of profitability. When it comes to profit sharing in shops, I actually don't advocate for basing it off of net profit. We always used a measurement that we called controllable profit or controllable margin. So a recognition of the fact that there were aspects or expenses in the business that uh, technicians or service advisor managers didn't have control over. Insurance is a as a classic example. There's just nothing that they could do. So
Especially right now.
you know
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So we, when I say I wasn't fully open book, I did share my controllable profit number with a large chunk of the employee base every month. And so that was it was all the revenue, and then it was a subsection of the various line items and expenses over which they could control. Um,
Are you looking
and
at just like more cost of goods sold, or are you adding in some expenses? Or tell me a little bit
cost of
about
goods
that
sold,
controllable profit. Yeah.
yeah, cost of goods sold was obviously the biggest part of it, represented more than 50%, of your revenue. But then utilities, at some level, I deem
They
controllable,
have some
right?
control. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so uniforms, right, you get billed when uniforms get lost, and these sorts of things. Or at one point my manager started negotiating certain uh, relationships with uniform vendors. So there's probably 25 kind of operating expenses,
Yeah.
and some, honestly, there's only probably about 7 or 8 of them that I would say are completely out of control, or out of the control of your average manager or technician, and the rest, they should have some sense for what they are. um,
That is really interesting because I think it gives them some accountability to want to save the shop some money where they can. And maybe, yeah, would it be nice to have that tool, but we don't necessarily need that tool. Or if it's a one-off job, whatever. I think it helps spread the responsibility out a little bit. Again, I think it helps clearly define what their bonus is going to be, or really it continues that conversation. So they're not only talking about profitability at the front side and understanding your theory on how you can pay them, but then they're also understanding what they can do to earn a better bonus. And, part of that is the expense side of things. And they do need to, maybe not use an entire can of anti-seize on every single car. Like there's just, it's little things like that that add up. And I think the incentive program that you have set up with that, or that you had set up with that, is really, really smart. I really like that a lot.
it it was I think it worked really well. I mean, it
Yeah.
absolutely got guys talking about topics that were not on the normal conversation list. And then, just generally speaking, the other part of it that I always try to keep front of mind is that if you're going to build an incentive, it needs to be an incentive. So when you start to think about, okay, what is it worth, what again, this goes back to knowing your numbers, but what can I afford to pay if this happens, was a a regular exercise that I was doing. And so i I was able to know what that potential, how much could I really afford to pay out if the things that we were working towards were achieved. And I was always trying to strike that balance between, okay, what is a number that I know will, like, get the guy's eyebrow to kind of go up a little bit, right? Say, oh, okay, this makes a difference. And then trying to, strike that balance in terms of understanding where we had to be as a business.
This is fantastic advice. I so much appreciate finally getting you on the show. And it was interesting how this came about, but such an easy conversation to have with you. Very impactful stuff. I have a bunch of notes here, and I think there'll be plenty of things that we should probably follow this podcast up with another podcast where we could dive deeper into even the compensation side, right? That was the whole plan today, was going into compensation. And we it feels like we're just touching the surface. And I think that's the beauty in a podcast, or the beauty in conversation, is that you start to identify those things that we should be diving deeper into, and we should maybe be thinking differently about. So I can't tell you thank you enough. It was such an honor to have you on the podcast today, and hopefully we get you back on to do another one here sometime soon.
Jay, I can't thank you enough for everything that you do. I think you do probably the hardest job, or tackling the biggest problem, that we have, and the work that you guys do at WrenchWay is really inspiring, for a lot of us who just want to see the industry rise, but feel like we may be too small to make a big difference. What you've gone out and accomplished in the face of a really daunting challenge is super impressive. So thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, the easiest way is look me up on LinkedIn or Facebook, Anders Gustafson. I am currently starting a business. It's called ShopLevers. It's based around helping shop owners understand the fundamentals of their business, understanding the levers that they can pull to grow their business. ShopLevers.com or Anders@ShopLevers.com are the easiest ways to reach me, and look forward to having as many conversations as we can.
All right, go check them out. We'll put some links in the show notes, and can't wait till the next time we're able to record with you. Thank you so much, Anders.
Thank you, Jay. Have a great one.
That wraps up another episode of Beyond the Wrench. If you liked this episode, please show your support by rating and following the podcast. You can also watch the video interviews on WrenchWay's YouTube channel. Speaking of WrenchWay, did you know Beyond the Wrench is managed and produced by the WrenchWay team? WrenchWay is an online community dedicated to promoting and improving automotive and diesel careers. We help technicians find the best shops to work at, and we also help auto, diesel, and CTE instructors get more support from local industry. You can learn more by visiting wrenchway.com.